Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 1 of the Roman Forum. When I recorded the first batch of episodes for this show, this was not the first episode I recorded. I have so much respect for Mike that I didn't reach out to him until after I'd recorded a few other episodes. But thinking about which episodes to release first, it really only makes sense to start with this one. The History Fangirl podcast is an interview show about places that I've traveled to, but so often when you travel somewhere, you leave wanting to know more. And since Rome was the first big international trip that I took way back in 2011, before I was traveling full time, and since Mike is the person that inspired me to go on that trip, I figured I would start with this episode. Our guest today is Mike Duncan. He's the host of both the History of Rome and the Revolutions podcast. I met Mike when I went on the History of Rome tour that he did in 2011, and it was this trip that inspired me to get out and keep going to see all the historical places that I love in real life instead of just reading about them. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the Roman Forum, its place in Roman society, and what happened to it in the centuries since the fall of Rome. Mike will also talk about his book, The Storm Before the Storm, which is coming out in October. I can't wait to read it. He released a chapter on his podcast feed, and it sounds really amazing. And at the end of this episode, find out how to enter to win your very own copy. All right, so right now we have Mike Duncan, the genius behind the Revolutions podcast and the History of Rome podcast. We're going to talk today about the Roman Forum. Hi, Mike.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm great.
So, a little backstory, so I met Mike on a trip to Rome, which was the first time I went on a multi-day international trip. It was 2011. Is that when
I'm going to say yes. I kind of forget.
So it was a while ago, but I was 26 or 27. I was older than I wanted to be when I started traveling. I thought when I was younger, I would have started traveling earlier, and it was your trip that just kind of was like, I can't miss this opportunity. Like, I can never make this up again. So thank you for inspiring me.
Yeah, no problem. That was a great trip.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Yeah, that was all time great trips.
All right. So I know you originally from the History of Rome podcast. We traveled to Rome together in Istanbul. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you got interested in Roman history?
I have been interested in Roman history from the time it goes back to when I was a kid. I would read encyclopedia entries on, most of like the ancient civilizations. So it's the Romans, the Egyptians, the Greeks, like the Mayans and the Inca, like all of these ancient civilizations were really fascinating. And then I just really got into history a lot. I didn't actually study history in college, though. I wound up studying like political science and philosophy. But going through all of that, political science and philosophy, that's a lot of ancient history that you have to learn. You have to do a lot of ancient reading. You got to read Cicero. You got to read Seneca. You got to read. And then on the Greek side, it's Plato and Aristotle. And then you go through like Machiavelli, and that's just commentaries on Livy. And you're back to talking about the Romans again. So when I got out of school, I started really teaching myself the history of the Roman Empire by reading the ancient sources. So I got into just reading Livy, reading Plutarch, reading Appian, reading like anything I could get my hands on of those ancient sources. And so this is back in 2005, 2006, which is also right when podcasting started to be a thing. People now know about podcasting in the last couple of years, but it's been around since 2003, 2004. And there was at the time like a pretty vibrant history podcasting community. And so as I'm teaching myself all this Roman history, I was like, I should go find the Roman History podcast because there must be one. And then that can help me even more. And when I went looking for it, there was no Roman History podcast or dedicated Roman History podcast. that existed. So I'm sitting there with this like pile of material, all these great stories that nobody ever studies or learns about, because all anybody ever knows about Rome is like Julius Caesar and Nero and Caligula and Cicero, like like a couple of really compressed generations. But, you go back, you read about the Samnite Wars and the Punic Wars and the founding of the Republic, and then on into the crisis of the 3rd century, like hundreds of years later. There's so many good stories that are just buried in there. So I said, I'll just do it. I'll start a chronological narrative of the Roman Empire from the beginning, and I'll just do that. And I figured it would take me a year and a half. It was one of those like it helped how stupid I was about what I was getting myself into. I had no conception of how long or if I'd known probably how long it was going to take, I maybe wouldn't have even started it. But I was so dumb that I just started publishing episodes. And I'm coming up like in a month on my 10th anniversary. Yeah, that was 10 years. And then I got to do tours and stuff out of it.
That's awesome. So before we start talking about the Roman Forum, I just have a couple questions. How do you feel about the fact that so many other podcasts look up to your podcast and have taken kind of the style that you did? Like, so I also listened to like the Byzantine History podcast and the Bulgarian History podcast. Like, did you think you were really starting something?
Well, no, I don't, especially because from where I come from, I was following quite consciously Lars Brownworth, who did
I love him,
12. Yeah, sure. He did 12 Byzantine rulers, and that was the one that I listened to. I was like, man, this is amazing. There's got to be a Roman version of this, and it didn't exist. So there's a lot of people that look to me and say like, and openly say like, oh, you inspired me, and then I did like a version of it. But, credit where credit's due. I got the idea from Lars Brownworth. I didn't just, there's nothing new under the sun kind of. But I think it's fantastic, because the thing that the history of Rome is and revolutions is narrative history, which I feel like in a lot of ways has been neglected by historians as a discipline, like as a way of teaching history. It's a lot more like studies of themes or studies of, really more like minute aspects of history, without ever stepping back and being like, a lot of people just don't know the basic story, don't know the basic plot line, don't know who the people are who did the things, what order things happened in. So I've always felt that was something that was missing from a lot of history these days. And so to have all these people now running around out there and telling the stories of all of these different things that interest them, I think it's great.
That's awesome. Yeah. I know for a fact that the Byzantine history has reference to you as like because obviously he's picking up where the history of Rome left off. But that's interesting. All right, let's dive in. So we're talking today about the Roman Forum. So you've obviously been to the Forum a million times, probably.
I've been to the Forum 5 times.
Okay, so a million times. I've been twice.
A million times. But I've been there. I've been there 5 times now.
So let's
go back again.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what the Roman Forum is. People probably, if they just close their eyes and think of ancient Rome and they forget their picture of the Colosseum, they're probably seeing the Forum, but they may not know what it is specifically.
Yeah. So I think the best way to describe the Forum is to just say that it was quite literally the center of Roman civilization. If you go all the way back to when it was like the archaic Romans, like those original settlements, Rome is famously semi-mythologically founded on the 7 hills, and the 2 initial hills, or the 3, you got the Capitoline Hill, Palatine Hill, the Aventine Hill. So in there, and there's just a valley that runs next to the Palatine Hill and the Capitoline Hill, which originally was kind of swampy marshland. And so people lived up on the hills. And then the Forum becomes the area where they come to. It's where you have markets. It's where you started having the first, religious shrines. It's where you would hold assemblies. It became just the gathering place for when the Romans collectively would get together. And then that started during the Age of the Kings, which is like, the 600s, 500s BC. And the Forum was the center of Rome. And for the next, more than 1,000 years.
why don't you talk about a little bit about some of the buildings that are at the Forum that people might have heard of?
So in the Forum right now, like if you go to Rome, the Colosseum is there. That's your anchor point, but that's the Colosseum is technically a bit outside the Forum. So it's adjacent to the Forum. The Palatine Hill is adjacent to the Forum. The Capitoline Hill is sort of looms above. That's where the Capitoline Museum is. There's a ton of great stuff in there. That's where the big wedding cake memorial to whichever king it was, Victor Emmanuel. I forget. Okay. That's past my time.
A little way. Yeah.
But in there right now is where like the Temple of the Vestas were, where the House of the Pontifex Maximus was. So that's where actually Julius Caesar, once he became Pontifex Maximus, lived in that house. So then there became like a shrine to him there. There was the Temple of Saturn, which became the treasury of Rome. That's where they kept all the state treasuries. There was where the Capitoline Hill begins was like the great archival building where they stored all the state papers and all the state records. It's basically all the principal shrines. And right now, unfortunately, what it is there's a pile of bricks over here and there's some stones over here and there's like 3 columns. So you do have to use your imagination when you go there, when you're scanning it, because it is in a lot of ways, it's a bunch of rubble now because, I mean, my God, we probably talk about this, what happened after the Romans left. But most of the buildings aren't there. But that's outside of the Forum. But yeah, those are the ones. So also, of course, is the Senate House, and then there was the principal rostra where people would go and deliver speeches to the people. The building that's there now, which is the Curia, the Senate House, that was also rubble, right? So right now it's a complete building, and it's a little difficult to get Italian tour guides to admit this, but it was rebuilt during the Mussolini era. They wanted to build it to give, it was like it's a reconstruction of what the building would have looked like, because that's a question that people legitimately have. They're like, everything else is rubble except for this one perfectly preserved brick building. Like, what's up with that? And it was rebuilt by Mussolini.
Any idea if it was rebuilt with any of the original material?
I don't know that.
Okay. So in Bulgaria, we have Roman ruins, and a lot of times what they'll do is wherever the ruin ends, they'll finish it off with like modern materials so that you can tell this is where the modern stuff starts, but it's like in the subway. So they can't just leave it as like a ruin, because otherwise you have no subway system in Sofia.
Right.
So in its heyday, what would it have been like to be there?
Very crowded.
Okay.
It would have been very crowded. The Romans had no concept of personal space, like at all. Like the Americans, and I'm assuming most, and Western Europeans have a degree of like, I need at least like a couple of feet between me and you for me to be comfortable. I think Americans even more so than almost anybody else in the world. The Romans didn't have that at all. The Romans wanted to be around people. They were actually really weirded out by being alone. That's a weird little quirk in their mentality. They just didn't like to be alone at all. And it's not a huge area. Like if you go there, I mean, you can walk one end of it to the other in whatever, like 10 or 15 minutes max, if even that long. Probably not even that long. You could probably walk it end to end in 5 minutes. But it's where everything happened. So you're talking about, it was jammed. And the other thing, it was jammed with like buildings. It was jammed with statues, and they were constantly tearing things down and rebuilding it. Like it went through, 5, 6, 7 different iterations. It wasn't just one thing that remained static. So it was under construction. It was jammed with buildings and temples and people, and it just would have been very crowded and very noisy, and probably incredibly smelly, right? Because I mean, the Romans had good sanitation, but not what we would consider great sanitation. So it was probably like, I don't know, dog and horse shit.
Yeah. Well, even like places where you get like 100,000 Americans into like a stadium don't smell that great every place.
Yeah. No, so it's very hot, teeming. And then you like, Italy in the summer, like that's what it would be like.
So because this was the center of Rome for so long, and Rome was powerful for so long, maybe we could cover some of the highlights of some historic events that would have taken place there. Is there anything that comes to mind as an event when you think of the Forum?
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to the very beginning of the founding of the city itself, like legendarily, like this is how central it was. Like there was like a battle between, like the rape of the Sabine women. Like when the Sabines came to, like, you know, confront the Romans about the fact that the Romans kidnapped all their women, like that battle took place in the Forum. So there was a lot of like there's a lot of mythology that was wrapped up there. And then you go forward. Now a lot of it like is speeches, you know, like every great orator is delivering speeches in that place. Every elections are happening in that place. So like every Roman that you've ever heard of spent a considerable amount of time there. Once you start getting to the late Republic, I mean, now we're at like, you know, this is where the Gracchi were when those great confrontations were going on. This is where Marius is, you know, confronting Saturninus. This is where the heads are being posted during the Sullan proscription. This is where Mark Antony is beaten up when he has to go back to Caesar. Unfortunately, it wasn't where we know this now, or I didn't know this, but now I do. When I went there for the first time, when I was probably 20, so this is probably like 7 years before I did the history of Rome, and I was very excited to see the place where Julius Caesar was assassinated, and Julius Caesar was not assassinated in the Forum because Claudius's supporters had burned down the Senate House, and the Senate House didn't exist at that particular moment, so Caesar was actually killed outside of Pompey's Theater, which is now a cat sanctuary.
I think that so when I was there on the first time with you guys, there's that square, and I can't think of the name of it, with all the Bernini fountains, and there's like a market there every day, and we had like free time for lunch, and me and some of the other people went to this restaurant, and they're like, why don't you come in the basement and see where Caesar was killed? And it was like, oh, okay, well that sounds cool. And I thought it was like a weird scam, but then later several other people told me like that's actually legitimately, like, not the exact spot, but like the basement is part of the level that it would have been. Yeah,
it's a part of Pompey's. I've been to that restaurant now a couple, 3 times. Yeah, of course. And like, you know, like, and they've also, you know, got claim to it, right? Like that's, I wouldn't call it like a gimmick, because they don't like, they don't market it heavily. But it definitely, that restaurant is sitting right on top of the foundation of Pompey's Theater.
Yeah, no, we'd already eaten. They didn't do anything. And then at the end, they were like, do you guys want to go see the basement? And we were like, okay, yeah, sure.
But
they could do
like,
more.
If you were to want to say, I went to the place where Caesar was killed, yeah, it's that restaurant off of Campo de Fiori.
Yeah.
Right there.
I don't know the names of the streets. And actually, I went back the second time. When I went, I had like a stopover. And so I went back to that restaurant again just because I knew it was tasty, and like, so, and it was like, it had a pretty view of the square. But I did go back in the basement.
Well, you only have to go there once. That's one of those things where you just like, I checked it off my list. Weird.
We think of like the Roman Republic and a lot of things happening there. And in my head, I have like HBO, the show HBO Rome, like images of that. What happened to it in the Empire?
What happened to the Forum in the Empire?
Yeah, I mean, was it still a center of political power?
Definitely.
Okay.
I mean, like, the center of political power really by that point has moved from the Forum per se to the Palatine Hill, right? The emperors took over the Palatine Hill and turned it into a giant complex. So that's by the time Augustus comes along and forward, it's really the Palatine Hill for the next 250 years. And the Forum itself is still, you know, the center of civic life and the center of daily life, but not so much. It's not, you know, the elections no longer matter, orators no longer matter. You're never going to like hear anything necessarily interesting because you can't say anything bad against the emperors. But very famously, almost to the point of cliche, Augustus, when he says that he inherited Rome made of bricks and turned it into a city of marble, he's talking a lot about what happened in the Forum, which is up until Augustus, so right around the zero. Rome was built out of brick. It was all brick. All the buildings were brick. It was not the pure white marble edifices that people think of when you think of Roman civilization. That's what you're picturing, like white columns and giant white buildings. All of that comes during the Imperial Age, during the High Imperial Age. So by the the 1st, 2nd century AD, so once you've moved out of the Republic and into the Empire, they've got the wealth of the entire Mediterranean world has been flooding into the Temple of Saturn, which is sitting there in the Forum. What do you do with all that money? You make it look way better. So the Imperial Age Forum, and anytime you see some artist's rendition of the Forum, right? There's a better than 80% chance you're looking at what it would have looked like in around 100 BC, like during the Antonines, like during Hadrian and Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, like that era is the absolute golden age heyday, when it looked the best, when everything was there, because the Colosseum wasn't even there until Vespasian, which is around about 70 in the 70s AD. Okay. So it wasn't even there yet.
Do we know what Romans thought of the Forum or how they felt about it? Like when I think of Washington, D.C., no matter what I feel, I still feel patriotism, right? Like, do we know what their connection was, especially maybe people that didn't live in Rome proper?
Well, knowing what, the average poor person thought about it is always tough when you're talking about Roman history, because you only ever hear about what the rich people thought about everything, because they were the only people writing anything down. But for them, at least during the Republic, and I know now more about the Republican era since I just finished this book, The Storm Before the Storm, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, forthcoming, Public Affairs Press, October 24th, 2017. That it was absolutely the center of political life. And so guys like Cicero, Marcus Crassus, the orator, Marcus Antonius, who was Mark Antony's grandfather, it was hallowed ground for them, because oratory and that kind of public engagement, it's where trials would take place. It's where you would shine. It's where you would make your name. If you were a candidate for office, this is where you would come and canvass for votes. If you were a triumphant general, you would pass through it on your way to the Temple of Jupiter. So it was very much hallowed ground politically. And then I would imagine just the poor urban plebs, it was a place where you could come to, watch a good speech, get some cheap food. It's probably the same way that somebody who was living in Washington, D.C. would think about like the mall. I mean, it's kind of that way. If it does have all the central shrines and all the central temples and all the central, there's a statue to the greatest of the Romans that are there. So if you're living there, it's probably just a place where you can sit down and have some shade. I would imagine is one of the things that the poor Romans would have thought about it.
So as the empire's power moved east and Rome started being attacked by all kinds of, it's been a while, but it's Goths, right? Ostrogoths?
Various Goths. Okay. Various Goths.
What happened to the Forum as Rome lost control of Italy?
Well, roundabout in the crisis of the 3rd century, which is like the mid 200s, the emperors moved the political center of the empire north to Milan. That's where they wound up moving, because they had to be on the frontier to battle all these people coming over the Danube and coming over the Rhine River. You don't want to be another couple of days further south, isolated on the end of this peninsula. So for military reasons, the empire's capital moved up to Milan. So now, the Forum had been the center of the greatest empire in the world. And now it wasn't that anymore. It lost its political, any kind of political power. But Rome was still an enormously large city. It was still a very populated city. You don't get to the point where like Rome is depopulated, which will come later. So it's still the center of Roman life. It's still the center of basically the largest city in the Mediterranean world, even if it's no longer the center of the greatest empire in the world. That had moved on to Milan, and then Constantine comes along and moves over to Constantinople. But you still had rich dudes living up on the Palatine Hill, and you still had, poor urban plebs running around looking for shade and,
Do we know anything about how it fell into disrepair?
Yeah, well, once you start getting there's a couple of sacks, right? But even the sacks, right? People think of the sack of Rome as being this great cataclysmic event, and it was, but more like for morale reasons, more than it was the capital and it was sacked and destroyed. So the Goths trashed it 50 years later. The Vandals trashed it, and by this point, you start getting people moving away from urban centers, at least in the Western Empire, and Rome started to just slowly but surely, year in and year out, generation in and generation out, started to be depopulated. And so you can picture it going through into what we used to call the Dark Ages. Now we have to call something else because we don't want to offend the medievalists. No, I'm classicist. That you have this huge infrastructure of a city that was once like 1 million people strong that is now dwindling down to hundreds of thousands. And I think when it hit rock bottom, like the population of Rome might have been less than 100,000. So it was, you're talking about like the ultimate almost ghost town is what it would have been in like the 800s, 900s AD. Again, I'm not an expert on that period. But it was really, really depopulated. So it would have just been, and that's when it starts falling apart into disrepair, right? If people want to build a house for themselves, that the Forum is right there and it's full of all these buildings that nobody ever uses anymore. And it's got all these great bricks. I mean, the Romans built great bricks. So they started to dismantle all of that stuff to build other things, to build new shelters and new places, to build new houses, to build new, barns, silos, all that stuff. Like why make your own stuff when you can just trundle on down to the Forum or anywhere else in Rome and, pick it clean.
So when did it start becoming a tourist destination again?
That's a good question. It always was for a certain type of person, a place of interest. Like going to Rome would have been an interesting thing to do, to go visit all these relics. And but by the 18th century and then into the 19th century, you start getting this, like the grand tour becomes a thing for these various, like, the British or French or whatever. There was like kind of a circuit that you would start to run around as you start getting more like bourgeois wealth is starting to come into things. Like, what do you do with this money? Oh, I'll go on like this, this long tour and see the sights. And Rome became one of the sites that you would want to see. And the crazy thing is, by that point, there had been so much debris and dirt and rubble that had built up that I want to say it was probably like 20, 30 feet worth of just like rubble and debris that had built up over the 2,000 years or so, or like, let's say 1,000 years since the fall of the Western Empire. And you can look at, there's those great Piranesi, probably pronouncing that wrong, Piranesi, like carvings, like wood, not wood carvings. What the word? They're like sketches. You can see them online, and they show like the Arch of Titus is dirt up to almost where you almost can't see the arch anymore, and it's just a guy sitting there next to like some sheep, and that's what it would have looked like at that time. So it didn't really start to get excavated and studied and become what it is today, which is a site that you go if you want to visit Roman history, until like the 1800s, till the 19th century is when you start getting that boom in archaeology. This is when, around the time when Pompeii would have been discovered, like there was a huge boom in interest in archaeology as a field, and that's when they started really excavating the bejesus out of the Forum.
This might be a complete tangent, so if you don't have an idea, that's really cool. But I was talking to someone else recently about Greek archaeology and how the Greeks got to keep so many of their relics. Now, obviously not a lot that's on the Acropolis, but they negotiated when they dug up a lot of things more recently that they're going to keep a lot, and Turkey lost so much. Do we know if Italy controls most of the relics that came out in the 19th century, or if they lost them?
Most of it they control. I mean, there's obviously things in the British Museum. There's things everywhere. But what Rome in particular had going for it was it had the papacy. So the people who control all of that were the popes. Like the majority of it came under the control of the papacy, of the Vatican. It's all in the Vatican. And that's probably the single best place is the Vatican Museum.
And that's something I haven't done. I have to go back and do that.
Oh, you haven't done the Vatican Museum?
No, because I went with you, and then I went on a very short day trip where I wasn't going to go to I have to go back to Rome.
Yeah, you do, because the Vatican is, famous for the Sistine Chapel and all the Renaissance stuff. But they have unquestionably the best collection of classical sculptures, classical everything. They've got it all. So they control most of it. So it didn't have that. There wasn't that like diaspora of archaeological cool stuff to Britain, to London, or to the Louvre.
Have you been to the Acropolis Museum in the last 3 years? I think it's newer.
No, I've never actually been to Greece. I haven't done Greece.
So the Acropolis is cool, but in the Acropolis Museum there's a video, and it is just century after century of other people stealing their stuff, and it is the most shade I've ever seen thrown by a museum, and it is amazing. But it's part of why I got interested in doing this podcast, was because I think it's very different to see. I'm spoiled. I got to grow up seeing Greek coins and Egyptian coins in Chicago and Texas, and that is cool for me, but it is not cool for those cultures that all of their stuff is gone. So that's I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and we did the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and they had a lot of stuff go too. But the guide that I had there, she was pretty ambivalent about it. She was like, it'd be nice if we had it, but at the same time, it's all in the British Museum, and the British are really good. Yeah, they stole it, and they're sitting on it, and it's a relic of their imperial crimes. But the British are really good at maintaining things. They're really good. They take it really super seriously. So she's like, if we get it back, that'll be great. But at least it's safe. It's safe in the British Museum. It is. I have a
theory that and this is what I think I noticed when I was there with you, and then again when I was there last time, Turkey doesn't have the same affinity for its Byzantine past that Greece has for its Byzantine past and for its Greek past. So I feel like when I was in Athens, that's where the flame of the Byzantine Empire is kept alive in people's minds. Really?
Yeah. When we went to Istanbul, they did not want to talk about they did not want to talk about the Roman period at all. I forget where any of us were at any particular point, but you'd go walking by some column and be like, what's that column just laying there? And it's like, oh, that was erected by Constantine for some reason. Who cares? Moving on. You're like, that's really interesting. What do you mean? That's okay.
No, it's completely.
They didn't even like talking about the Byzantines, let alone the Roman period.
Oh no.
They just want to take you to Topkapi Palace and show you the crown jewels.
Well, it's not their ancestors really of most of the people, or if they are, they're so many centuries. Whereas I felt like in Athens, you go in their museums, there's a lot more Byzantine art, but also all their churches are Orthodox, and
sure.
I felt like you should, if you want to study Eastern Roman history, you should go to Istanbul because it's super cool and it's got lots of cool stuff. But if you want to learn about it from people that care about it, you probably also need to stop in Athens.
Yeah. Which I've never been to Athens. We're working on it.
I think maybe you would like it. It's a cool city.
Yeah. It's Athens. I'm gonna go there.
Yeah.
Just haven't done it yet.
I feel so I haven't been to Paris, and part of the problem is I know I'm gonna like it too much, and how do I go for 5 days and not just do everything? And so I get that about a lot of cities. I just can't.
Paris. I mean, we could do a whole one of these about Paris too, because it was something that many times.
Once I've gone to Paris, so I'm going in September, so we'll have to do this again about some place in Paris. Tell me which place you want to do in Paris, and then I'll make sure to stop there. Okay. All right, so let's talk about your book. And so I first heard you wanted to write a book when I met you, but this book is not the book that I think you were thinking about then. Tell us what's in this book, and how did you decide that this was going to be your topic?
Well, now I'm actually curious. What book was I going to write? There's always been something kicking around. What did I say I would write?
At the time, you said you were going to write a biography of Agrippa or something with him in it, which I think would be super cool.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, that makes sense.
So future book, maybe.
Yeah, future. Okay, so future book would be Agrippa. Or a biography of Aurelian. That'd be the other one.
I mean, I think you can write unlimited books. We'll just do that.
That's true. This is to answer your question so that my parents doesn't get mad at me. So it's called The Storm Before the Storm, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. And it covers the 50 or so years between, let's say, 135 BC and about 80 BC, which is the two generations before you get to Julius Caesar and Pompey and Crassus and Mark Antony and Octavian and Cleopatra, which is a story that everybody knows, right? There's a book about Caesar almost every year. There's a book about Cicero that'll come out. Everybody knows that's what the HBO Rome series was about. Like that generation, that last generation. Shakespeare, has a play about the last generation, that Brutus and Cassius, these guys. So that's the fall of the Republic. What we don't seem to talk about very much is it's not like the Roman Republic was super healthy in 50 BC and it just got crashed by this generation out of random. Like things had been breaking down for quite a while. So let's go back 2 generations and see what it is, what started the process. Rome was triumphant. Rome defeated Carthage. Rome defeated the Greeks, conquered the Greeks. Rome had control of Spain. Rome was the most dominant power in the Mediterranean world. The Republic was by about 146. 146 is the sort of the famous point at which they simultaneously annex Greece and North Africa into the empire. So now they're the strongest, most dominant thing in the Mediterranean world. So what happened? It started to unravel, is what happened, for a variety of reasons that I will go into in the book. If you purchase The Storm Before the Storm, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, I'll tell you all about it. The impetus for writing it a bit, it's a fascinating 50-year period. It's the Gracchi brothers, it's Marius, it's Sulla, wars, betrayal, intrigue, all the good stuff. But the question I got asked more than any other question the whole time that I was doing the history of Rome was, is the United States Rome? Is America Rome? Are we the new Rome? If we are the new Rome, are we having a similar historical trajectory? And the whole time I was doing the podcast, I always kind of put those questions off and was just like, no, let's just do Roman history and not worry about it too much. But it got into my head a little bit, and I was like, okay, I'll sit down, I'll think about this. And if America is Rome, where would we be on the timeline? So are we at the very beginning where it's Rome was famously founded by a bunch of vagabonds and escaped slaves and kind of ruffians. It was not a great group of people. And then you look at the United States and the early colonization. It's these are kind of the castaways and the people who are trying to get away from, the old world. They're not fitting in, so they want to go someplace new. Okay, so then you have this little oligarchy gets together and overthrows their king. That's what happened in 509. That's the founding of the Republic. The American Revolution, kind of the same thing. You got the little oligarchical clique of large landowners and shipping magnates get together. They break away from the king. They found a republic. Then you start expanding regionally, which is roughly equivalent to the Samnite Wars, the United States sort of expanding across North America. And then you have these big global wars against the Carthaginians, where the Romans wind up at the end of that being the most dominant power in the world, or in the Mediterranean world at least. And then the United States, we go through World War I, World War II, the Cold War, we kind of emerge from that. And we're now the most arguably the most powerful country in the world. So that kind of looks roughly the same. If you squint, that's the timeline. And then you start honing in on what happened to the Romans after they achieved this supremacy, after they followed this trajectory. Like, what happened to them? You start getting like massive economic inequality as the rich are getting insanely richer and the poor are just getting poorer. You start having, with no sort of great enemy to bind them together, you start having political factionalism and the elites turning on each other. You start getting the privatization of the armies. You start getting there are huge questions about who should be allowed to vote, who shouldn't be allowed to vote, who's a citizen. You have these tiers of Italian citizenship where if you weren't a Roman, but you were an Italian, you were like a second-class citizen. And so the social war erupts, and that's all covered in the book. So there's a lot of, echoes, is I guess what I would call them, as to what America is currently facing and what the Romans faced, under something that might be considered similar circumstances.
Do you feel like our current leadership would be more from this time period, the breaking before a break, or do you feel like it would be the result of a break?
Like what we have right now?
Yeah.
Well, problematically, one of the things that allowed Caesar and then Augustus to topple the Republic, and they'd never overtly declared an autocracy, but to sort of slowly accrue the power, one person slowly accruing the power that turned it into a de facto dictatorship, even if they never said, like, I am now the emperor of Rome. That never happened. One of the reasons that happened is because the Senate had just stopped being responsive to their to the people, to the people who lived in the empire. They were so obsessed with protecting their own privileges and their own version of an oligarchical little city state that they wanted to maintain at all costs, that it became very easy for everybody else to just be like, well, you people are not doing anything that helps me. This guy says he's going to do some things that'll help me. He's talking land reform. He's talking a grain dole. Like, he's talking about, kicking you in the face, which also sounds good to me. And that's why people were sick to death of the Senate in Roman times. So when I look at the United States and, you see the approval ratings of Congress are like abysmal, and, kind of with good reason. They don't seem particularly responsive to what the citizens of the United States need or want. And so, you get some brilliant, some Caesar-esque character that might come crashing through the doors a generation or two from now. I could see a lot of people being like, yeah, fuck Congress. It's great. Do it, man. Like, fine. I hate those people. And that's what it is. Dictators, at least in Rome, they didn't take over and everybody was mad about it. They took over and everybody was happy about it.
Oh, really? I don't really think I've ever thought about public sentiment before.
Yeah, they were thrilled in a lot of ways.
And the Senate never went away. They just lost power and it just became like a club for rich, important people, right?
Correct. Yeah, it becomes a little social club. But it's still prestigious to be a part of it. If you were a particular senator who had the ear of the emperor, you might have some power. Which is, if you project out and say, oh, I mean, is the United States going to turn into an empire at some point? Like, yeah, probably. I mean, not to be like so, but I can see that we would just have a president, and the president would still exist, and the House of Representatives and the Senate would probably still exist, but it would be a lot more for show, right? Then that's the way Augustus set it up, to have all the forms still in place, to have all the language still be the same. There were still consuls that were elected every year, right, under the empire. You still had elections every year. They were just all pantomime.
What's interesting, because the last few presidents have taken so much power, but they have talked like presidents, and our current president has kind of ceded away power, but is breaking all the institutional norms of things. It's kind of maybe the opposite in a way. Not that it might not have the same end, but
no, I agree with that. In the last 100 years, the last 100 years has just been the slow accumulation of power in the executive branch, like starting with Theodore Roosevelt, going through Franklin Roosevelt, going through everything that happened during the Cold War, and then in the 90s and even in the 2000s, there was a lot of just like Congress being like, well, the executive branch will figure it out. The executive branch will do it. And then once you start getting into gridlock between the presidency and Congress, you start getting more executive orders. You start getting more things run directly out of the executive branch. So the presidency right now is obviously, I mean, anybody who knows the history of the United States, the presidency is way more powerful than it was ever intended to be. In its breadth and depth of what it actually touches on. But Trump has come along and seems singularly uninterested in actually weird. Like it's so weird. Like he seems so uninterested in the job that Congress is really taking the lead again. And they're about to, well, we don't have to get into that.
Okay.
You live in Bulgaria now. You don't have to deal with fallout.
Well, I follow you on Twitter, so I know you're not shy about this stuff, but it's interesting to talk about it just because I talk to a lot of Europeans who don't really understand what's going on. It's actually nice to talk to an American about it.
Well, an American who doesn't understand what's going on.
No, I don't either, but like
I don't think anybody really understands. I don't even think that Trump understands what's going on. Like this is absolutely one of those, like the dog that caught the car and now doesn't know what to do. I don't think anyone, including the inner circle of his family, expected him to win. And I don't think that there was a plan for what to do if he did win. And yet here we are having to deal.
So, all right. So we're going to read the book. We're going to buy the book first, and then we're going to read it. Yes. And we're going to learn about a parallel that we should it's interesting, and it might be a foreshadowing parallel, and we should all read it.
Yeah. And it's a narrative history, right? So it's a 50-year history. That's not, and then this person is Pelosi and this person is, it's not that. But there's a lot in there. And it would be nice if one of the things that I'm kind of a practical historian. I'm not an academic historian. So I'm comfortable believing that we can look to history to learn lessons from it. I mean, people can use bad historical analogies and do bad historical analysis. But if history is to have any purpose at all, if it is to be worth studying for any reason except just like the knowing of facts, it's to try to make better decisions than maybe somebody else did, to look at what decisions other people made, whether they went well or went poorly, and then say, okay, well, what can we do different, or what should we do the same, to maybe navigate our version of this same kind of sequence of events better than they did, to look to the past, to make decisions in the present, to like make a better future. That seems like a good use of history. So I'm into it, and like to give this book to the people and have them read it. And pay you for it. Yes, and pay me for it. It's very important. Because you've been giving the world so much free stuff. Anyone who likes your stuff should just buy this one book. Yeah. It's been, we're coming up on almost 350 episodes that I've put out for free. People. Hello, people. Every week it just shows up in your little podcast machine. You can buy this one book for me. So there's going to be a link in the show notes, and follow the link, and then there'll be a link to the book. Buy the book. You can pre-order it now. It comes out in October. Is it going to be on Audible in October as well? Yes. And are you narrating it, or did they hire someone? No, I will be narrating. Okay. It. I hate when people that I've heard their interview, like Timothy Snyder is one of my favorite historians. I listen to but I can't read history. I have to listen to it, and it's not him. And I've heard him give a million interviews, so it's weird to me that it's not him. Who'd you say? Timothy Snyder. He did like Bloodlands and okay. Yeah. But he doesn't read on Audible, and I'm just like, I know I've listened to you talk for hours. How can you not do your own book? Have you recorded it yet? No, I have not. Okay. As of this moment, the deal has been signed. I have an audiobook publisher, but the book itself, like, it's such a long process, like actually coming out with the book. The actual finished, final, proofed version of the book doesn't even exist yet. It won't exist for another couple of weeks. So once that is done, then I will record it. And yeah, I mean, no audiobook publisher worth their salt would get somebody else to read a book by a guy who made his bones in audio. Like, why would there would be a revolt. Like nobody would accept it.
I would not be able to listen to it.
It would be a marketing blunder of massive to not have me read the book. So I will read the book. Chapter 1, The Beasts of Italy.
All right. So people are going to go buy the book. They're going to pre-order the book. Then they're also going to buy it on Audible because they also want to listen to it. So they're going to buy it twice.
Yeah, but you got to buy the hardcover book because we're trying to make me award-winning podcaster and New York Times best-selling author Mike Duncan. That's the new plan. So you got to buy the book because the audiobook sales don't count towards this really nebulous and weird thing that is the New York Times bestseller list, which is like they have this secret sauce that they use. It's like they don't hide it. They're not transparent about it. I've been researching it. The New York Times bestseller list is actually protected under the First Amendment as editorial content because an author one time sued him back in the 80s for not putting his book on the list, and the Supreme Court actually ruled that it's editorial content. It's not just a report of the number of books that were sold. Like it's a very weird thing.
It's interesting.
Well, so you got to buy the hardcover. You can also buy the ebook if you would like. And then buy the audiobook as a supplement.
Yeah, and then maybe give some away to people as gifts who
Yes.
50
to 60 of your closest friends, they could all use this book. It's a good book. Actually, I'm quite proud of it. I think it's a good book. I just read it again for the 9 millionth time, and I'm not sick of it yet. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on. And we'll talk again after I've been to France. We'll talk about France.
Okay.
All right, cool. Thanks. So that's a wrap on episode 1. I want to thank Mike Duncan again for coming on the show. A few notes real quick. First of all, thank you for listening to this first episode of the History Fangirl podcast. I'm really excited about this. If you enjoy the episode and you want to get more, please go into iTunes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. It would be immensely helpful if you would go into iTunes and rate and review us. If you want to put 1 star or 5 stars, it's up to you, but it would really help if you would rate and review. The next episode is going to be about Rila Monastery, which is a Byzantine monastery in Bulgaria that is one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever been in. It has a really interesting history, and the guest will be Eric Halsey from the Bulgarian History Podcast. So I'm really excited to share that conversation with you all. And then this week's contest. So if you would like to win your very own copy of The Storm Before the Storm, go to historyfangirl.com, find the article for this episode, which is episode 1, The Roman Forum, and instructions will be posted in that article. Good luck.